Hello, Aanchal. Welcome to Writersmelon. I'm so excited to see you. I have been reading your books for the past couple of weeks now, since we decided that we are going to talk. And in general, I have been so fascinated by this whole idea of partition and stories around it. And yours, particularly, is so interesting, where you talk about the material memory around the book. So, you know, just start I would just like to start by asking you, what drew you, like what was your inspiration to start writing this book and to travel all the way across and hear these stories? When was this first idea came into picture? Please elaborate on that. I saw you wrote a bit of it in the introduction, how in Purani Delhi you saw a house and you met this person. So yeah, please go ahead and tell us about the germ of the idea when it came about.
Firstly, thank you for having me and deeming my work worthy to discuss. I really appreciate it. So, I grew up in Delhi and I grew up reading the CBSE curriculum. And in that curriculum, yes, we discussed partition, but it was not really the landscape of common people. It was
Yeah,
very much the politics of
political
partition.
outlook. Yeah.
Right. It was the story of Gandhi and Nehru and Jinnah, and mostly actually the independence movement,
Yeah.
not so much partition. And I think we see these events sometimes as synonymous with one
Yeah.
another when we are speaking, but in fact they are quite different and they register quite differently in people's memories and also in historical consciousness. So, needless to say, growing up, I never, like many people, I think my age, I never had the interest to delve into family history. And it was only in the year 2013 that I went to my grandfather's house, my Nana's house in North Delhi, and he lives in a house that was built in the 50s. And his family came from Lahore. And the house has three brothers and their wives and their children all living together. And my mom grew up in that house. And so I went with a friend of mine who's a journalist who wanted to write a story on the house because it was so old. And he
Mm-hmm.
was kind of doing a
Okay.
story on the old houses in the city. So while we were there, my grandfather's elder brother, he brought out all of these old objects that were in the house because the house was so old. It had
Mm-hmm.
numerous old things. And he says that, these few objects are older than the house. They were actually carried by my parents from Lahore to Amritsar and then to Delhi. And they're very ordinary things. Like there was a ghara, which is a vessel in
Ghada.
which tea is made, a guz, which is a yardstick by which you measure fabric.
Mm.
Their father and grandfather, they had a clothing store.
Okay.
And so these were the objects that I'm sure there were more things, but these are the objects that have survived, the objects that they chose to carry to Amritsar. And when they were speaking about those objects, when they were touching and feeling, and it felt like a very visceral kind of portal into the
Mm.
past. Yes, I remember my childhood when I would ride my bicycle through the gullies in Lahore. It was very, very immediate. It was very potent. It was very unexpected as well because
Mm.
I couldn't. Of course, we know that objects hold memory,
Mm.
but we also have to pour memory into objects. And I
Yes.
had never seen an object so seamlessly transport somebody back into the past,
The
but also
memory.
back across a very highly militarized border. Like it was as if my grand uncle, he was holding these objects and he was just transported back to his childhood. And through that lens, I began to think seriously about partition for the first time. And I have to say that this is in my early 20s, and it's quite late if I look at it in retrospect, because all four of my grandparents came from what became Pakistan. So ideally, I these stories had always been present.
Mm.
I don't think I had ever taken the time to
To
ask.
ask them. Yes. And so yes, so I can talk about the political lens that you said that we are always looking it through when we are studying history. And even the political, even if we see it through the political lens, I think a lot of the historical facts are still not very clear in our head, because everything was such a chaotic in those days. I mean, I was just reading through, you said that Indians just got to know it in 3rd of June that there will be a there will be divided countries. And by the time it was executed, it was just like 2 months, and people just could not believe it. People could not come to terms with the fact. They were not prepared. Some of them were so sure that they would go back. So from a political lens, I would like you to like take us through these very key historic moments, such as how Jinnah really put it across that this is needed, how Radcliffe was so confused to put a line which is ironically still his bears his name. So just take us through some of these historical facts, which I'm sure a lot of us don't know fully or know it halfway unless we are like really good history students and are going through it. So yes,
Well, the politics of partitioning a country is very complicated. And I
yes,
think what is very interesting is even people that migrated from one part of the country all the way to the other part, your and my families included, did not really understand the
what's
reasons
happening?
why
Yeah.
this was happening. So if you really think about it, entire lives were disrupted, fractured, completely
Yes.
broken, and they really don't understand the root cause. So it really tells you that what happens in the center percolates down in a very strange way to common people. And the
Yeah.
stories of those common people, their hardships, their very unique losses, they weren't really registered anywhere. They weren't recorded, they weren't written down. What was written down, of course, was like what was happening in the corridors of political history, which is
Yes.
also very complicated. And there are multiple viewpoints to look at everything.
Yeah.
I will try. It's very difficult to say why partition happened,
And
what
what
was
was
going on.
going in their heads, I'm always so curious, like what were they thinking? What was their motivation? And I mean, I'm always so curious, like from a human perspective also, these leaders, what made them take this decision? Was it only the greed for power, or it's just confusion, or they also didn't know what they were doing?
I think all of those are very simplistic ways to look at a very complicated situation, but you're not wrong. The situation is inclusive of all those things that you're talking about. Yes,
Hmm.
um, but I think maybe one of the key moments when there was a political shift is probably the Quit India movement.
Okay.
Um, in 1942, August 8, August 9, Gandhi announces the Quit India movement, which is a direct call to the British to leave India. At
Hmm.
this point, the Congress is the dominant political party, but of course, there are multiple other parties. There is the Muslim League, there is
Hmm.
Akali Dal, several other parties, and the Congress holds this Quit India rally at
Hmm.
in Bombay, Goalia Tank Maidan, and all the Congress leaders are there. Huge numbers, people come out to support them, and the very next day, all of the upper Congress leaders are arrested. They're put in prison. And
Hmm.
they're put in prison for months, years, which ultimately ends up creating a political vacuum,
Okay.
which is filled by the Muslim League.
Muslim League.
They start
Okay.
to gain power, they start to gain support, not just of the locals, but they also start to work with the British.
Hmm.
Based on that, the demand for Pakistan rises.
Hmm.
Pakistan, the very word Pakistan, which was coined in the 1930s in the corridors of Cambridge by students, is actually an acronym.
Mm-hmm.
It stands for Punjab, Afghania, Kashmir, Sindh, Balochistan. All the territories that one hoped would be part of Pakistan when it was conceived, the word was conceived in the
Hmm.
1930s. Um, as the Muslim League gains power, it does become very apparent to the British,
Hmm.
who post war have a very empty treasury and
Yes.
cannot hold India as a colony anymore. They can't afford to hold the jewel in their crown, as it says.
True.
And it becomes evident that not only will they have to leave India, but the growing discontent between various communities in the country will eventually lead to two different nations, the creation of
Hmm.
two different nations. Not to mention the growing power of the Muslim League, who are convinced that if the British leave and India is independent, they will be treated as second class citizens to a Hindu majority.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I'm explaining this in a very simplistic
Yes,
way,
this
but
is exactly what I wanted to know from you, because the thing is, we read history in such a disconnected manner in our textbooks. And unless we are professional historians, sometimes as a common person, it's very difficult to dissect these events into something leading to
right,
something else, So for me,
absolutely.
this made a lot of sense.
But
Yes,
it's far more complicated than that. Like
then that, yes, of course.
you mentioned Jinnah being like the,
Ambitious at that point, I don't know.
right. However, Jinnah was also the person, say, in several years ago, that was the first person to put forth the proposal for Hindus and Muslims to vote together. So he
Yeah,
was very much like for the unity of
democracy.
various communities. Well, I mean, yes, of course, democracy, but also he was very much for the unity of several
Of the two
communities in India
communities.
working together, right? And there are circumstances which led him to become the person he became.
Yeah,
So I don't think that we can really view even political figures in this kind of black and white
right way.
um, way. And I am not an archival historian, and I only know things that I have studied
Yeah,
as through my interviews with common people
true.
about these political figures. So
Absolutely.
anyway, as you mentioned earlier, South Asians did learn that their country would be partitioned on June 3rd, 1947, and a plan was announced called the Mountbatten Plan, named after the last viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten, and supported by various members of various political parties. Now, who would draw the line? Right? And okay, fine, Pakistan will become a reality, but where will this Pakistan lie?
Yeah.
And who will draw this border? Will a Hindu draw it? Will a Muslim draw it? An Indian draw it? A future Pakistani draw it? Ultimately, a lawyer called Sir Cyril Radcliffe was appointed as the map maker. And he had no map making experience. And he had never been,
To
famously,
India.
um, well, not just India, he had an assistant, and in his assistant's letters, because Radcliffe didn't really leave any papers, any letters for us. So we know parts of his movements through his assistant's letters.
Hmm.
And in the assistant's letters, it says very clearly that Radcliffe had never been east of Gibraltar. And it was his lack of sort of knowledge about the politics of India that the British government thought
Thought
would
he
be
is
an
a
impediment.
neutral. Yeah.
Yes. However, to partition any land, one needs to have a very firm grasp not only of the land itself, the physical
Yeah.
land, but also the communities that exist on that land, the social life of
Hmm.
people, the communal life of people. Um, where do water bodies flow from? Where is agriculture most prevalent? So there were a number of factors, religion obviously being perhaps the prime one,
Hmm.
that led him to draw this line. He was not alone though, so he had an assistant and he had two assistants. One was a British man and one was an Indian. And he also had two commissions, boundary commissions, one
Hmm.
for Bengal and one for Punjab. And these commissions were made of judges,
Hmm.
judges of different religions. Ultimately, there was so much disagreement between the various judges on these boundary commissions that I think Radcliffe had to rely on the maps that he was provided, on the little that he had been able to travel, because as soon as he got to India, he felt very sick.
Hmm.
And basically, the natural course of rivers and waterways. And
Hmm.
so, as a result, I mean, this is very vague. He played a very vague line, which would sometimes cut through villages, sometimes cut through water bodies. The Kushiara River on the banks of Karimganj, which borders, Bangladesh. The,
Bangladesh.
the river is the border. The center of the river is the border. So like absurd things like this happened, and of course the fact that he was told that his border had to be ready by August 15th. So
Okay.
that's about 5 weeks. He delivered his border by August 12th.
Okay.
And the
2 days.
the border was only announced on August 17th, days after Pakistan's Independence Day on August 14th and India's Independence Day on August 15th. So people celebrated independence, but they didn't really know whether they were in India or Pakistan, particularly if
Mm.
they were provinces that were very enmeshed with
Closed with each
all
other.
kinds of people,
Yeah.
all kinds of religions and ethnicities. And so you could just imagine the utter confusion when the border is announced, and the chaos and the fear and anxiety and violence.
Mm. But this violence and anxiety was not something that was anticipated by many leaders, right? So this was something that became more of a surprise to everybody, or uh, because
There's
just
a very famous quote by Mountbatten in an interview that he gives on the Times of India on like July 10 or something like
yes.
that, July 10, 47, where someone asks him, "Do you anticipate there being large scale migrations?"
Mm.
And he very confidently says, "No, I don't anticipate there being large scale migrations
Yes.
because no one really did. Because what would the new countries do? Like, if India was going to be a Hindu majority, there were clearly also going to be minorities living in the
Yeah.
country. If Pakistan was going to be an Islamic majority, Muslim majority, there were clearly also going to be minorities. And
Yes.
many people believed that.
That it could
Many people,
coexist. Yeah.
they could not just coexist that, but also the borders would be soft borders. They could
Soft.
go
Yeah.
back and forth.
Yeah.
How can you completely partition
Yeah, because there
this?
was no enforcement at that time, right? On the borders, like there was no official enforcement. All the violence, etc., erupted amongst people themselves. There was no, like, for example, in Berlin, we had a Berlin Wall for a long time, but there was like proper
Right.
border control there. There were security guards
There
standing
was
there.
border control. There was border control on, I would say, the Punjab side very quickly. Like for
Okay.
instance, the Baga Atari border post came up in October '97. An actual post with a gate. So,
97,
sorry,
47.
47. October, like October
So in
11.
few months time, right?
Yes, in 2 months' time. Yes.
Okay.
And you can assume that there are like other posts of similar nature, like, but there are like the Kasur border post only came up like decades later.
Hmm.
So you wouldn't even know when you like crossed over. And there are
Yes.
stories, so many stories of people accidentally crossing over.
Hmm. So no documentation, nothing. People were just moving recklessly from one place to
No, that's
another
not true.
out of.
That's not true. No, no, no. No, that's not true. When someone arrived, let's say when someone arrived in a city, if they went to a camp, there was registration.
Okay,
You get a ration card. Yes, these became people's identifications at that time.
at that
Yeah,
time.
but of course, there are many people that didn't have access to all of this as well, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So, I mean, the one thing that I want to make very clear is that there's no one way to tell a partition story.
Yeah.
And there is certainly no one way to inherit a partition story either.
Yeah.
Everyone's story is different based on their circumstance, based on how much they knew about partition,
Yes.
how much they believed in this cementing of the
Division. Yeah.
border. Right. Because there were people for whom they were in denial. They just
Yeah.
couldn't believe. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And now let's talk about the material memory that you're saying, or which is basically the centerpiece of your work, and which makes it so unique, right? So when you talk about, or when you talk to so many families who were kind of displaced and who brought some material with them, something with them, which was anyway so hard to do, right? It was so difficult to just come across alive. Uh, let's put aside bringing up your, let's say, childhood toy or a ghada, or I don't know, different things. How did you, let's say, connect with uh, these uh, these aspects, and what made you so excited about it, and how did it? And I was quite amazed to see the volume of it. There are like so many articles that you bring about, and the stories that you bring about. Tell us more
And
about
obviously,
this.
there's so many more. Like what is in the book is just a selection, right?
Yes.
Like we had so many different kinds of things, and I think what one was able to carry determined also how much one knew about partition.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
for instance, if people knew well in advance
Mm.
and they were able to migrate well in advance, they would also have taken their entire households on the goods train, right?
Mm.
Someone, and I think through this process, you can also understand what we consider precious. Is
Mm.
it something that's monetarily precious? Is it something that's a family heirloom? Is it something that was so mundane but has become precious as the decades have passed? Or is it just something actually so mundane that is hardly ever used anymore?
Yeah.
And one wishes they would have carried something else. So I think I used the object as a catalyst because it felt like a gentler way to enter into a landscape that was still so traumatic to speak about.
Mm.
When I started this work, I think 63 or 64 years had passed. And even then, when you first ask people about partition,
Mm.
they will always ask you a question back. Why do you want to know?
No. Yeah.
Why are you talking about these old things? What will it change? And though it wouldn't change anything, I just thought it was very important for subsequent generations to understand the difficulties and the sacrifices, but also the triumphs.
Yeah.
It was very important to create an archive with human voices in it
Correct.
because like people made that history
Yeah.
and they were living history. There were still members of that generation alive, which is they're very few now. They're at the tail end of their lives. But I thought that how could my grandparents have become data? Why were they just a number? Why didn't I
Yeah.
know their stories? Why had I never asked? I think that was really what
Mm.
bothered me, that I had never bothered to ask. Like when I studied it in school, I didn't come home and say, "Oh,
Ask
what
them.
is this partition? Did you live through this partition? Were you there?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Which seems like it seems like the logical thing to have done, but I
Mm.
don't think history was taught to me in a way that, or many of us, in a way that it felt like it was
That you
our
question
personal.
it. Yeah. That you question is what happened, or it makes you
It was
curious.
taught to us in a way that it was so far back that it couldn't
Mm.
even impact us.
Yeah.
And so the object, it was also a way to build this social landscape of the past. What were the objects that people used? What were the objects in their house? Where was their house? What newspaper did they get? How did they eat? How did they make their food? What clothes were they wearing? These were the kinds of questions I was asking. I never started with partition. We would always arrive
Start with
to
the,
partition.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
like
what I was thinking. I mean, these objects would help you to start a conversation, to break ice, give it a texture, to the story, because often people are also not that expressive or articulate, right? I mean, I remember talking to my grandmother, and most of the times I used to feel she's saying the same story all the time. I mean, do you have any other story? You're always talking about the same story, how you all came separately, or how it was so.
but
So,
but
being a
but
child, you kind of,
try to understand the impact that one story
yes,
must have
exactly.
had on her. That it is like we what we choose to tell
Yeah,
and what we choose to either leave out or maybe consciously forget is very much determined by
yes.
how we have lived our past.
Exactly, exactly. So you
Right?
don't understand this as a child, you know. That time you're not like,
Yeah,
you're like, why are you telling the same story? So that used to be my reaction to when I
yeah,
used
yeah,
to listen
of
to my
course,
grandmother.
of course.
But then when you talk about these objects, I mean, as kids, we never really thought about this, you know. So that's what
No,
really
neither
drew,
did I.
yes, that's what
No,
really
and
drew me to this whole concept. I mean, amazing, Achal. I look forward to finishing your book, and thank you so much for coming and taking us through all these interesting facts. And I think sometimes it's so important to know the facts, to know the actual events. Even though there are obviously multiple perspectives and multiple stories, but even to form a perspective, it is important to know exactly what happened and to
Yeah,
have the
yes,
facts
I
true.
think the knowledge of history is very important because it very much informs how we live today, but
Yes.
also how we are shaping our
Our
future for
future,
future
absolutely,
generations. So
absolutely.
I always see history as a learning tool, so that events
Yeah,
like partition cannot be repeated. But I don't know. I don't know if we really learned from partition.
that's
This is
true.
why I think also the stories of people who have lived through an undivided land, who have seen largely syncretic societies,
Mm,
who have sacrificed, who have witnessed, who have survived, their stories are very important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Achal. I wish you all the best for your future work. And it was lovely talking to you. Thank you so
You
much.
as well. Thank you.
Bye.